All right, do we want to get started?
Yeah, for everyone who just hopped in, that was a song from Mariah Parker, our guest. I liked it, great flow.
All right, yeah, so welcome everybody. This is technically a general meeting for YDSAGT, but we're having a sort of a special meeting today. That's why it's on Zoom instead of Discord. We're having a town hall and interview with County Commissioner Mariah Parker from Athens-Clarke County, District 2. So she is a doctoral student at UGA, DSA member, an open socialist, and also on the side a hip hop artist, going by the stage name Lingua Franca. Sorry if I'm butchering that pronunciation. Uh, as you can see on the map, Athens is a little bit out of the way from the metro Atlanta area, but we often share a lot of the same conditions, being the Deep South, facing the same restrictions from the state legislature. And so there's a lot of common issues that Athens and Atlanta face that we want to discuss today, and hopefully we can get some insight from the county commissioner. Uh, so one of those issues is the issue of defunding the police. So over last summer, we witnessed overwhelming outrage against police brutality, but we keep seeing this problem happen over and over again. We started seeing these protests back in 2014 in Ferguson, even earlier in the 90s in LA, even earlier back in the 1960s, 1980s. But we've seen the same issue continuously happening. Despite all these liberal efforts towards reform, it seems like nothing's actually stopping this expanding militarization and brutality from police departments. And part of that is because police budgets have been continuously growing despite waves of austerity towards other public services. And we've seen a direct connection between this and increased militarization of the police, increased incidents of brutality, generally more power being given to the police and police unions that makes them resist any efforts towards reform and decarceration. In response to this, many activists have called for defunding the police as a key solution, not just to sort of address the issue of police brutality, but also in the long run weaken the power of police departments and hopefully move us away from this system of policing and incarceration. So just as some context, I believe this is the Atlanta city budget. Here are all the different areas from the Public Defender's Office, Human Resources, Finance, City Planning, Parks and Recreation, Water Services, but by far the largest component of the Atlanta city budget is the police department. That's that big bar at the bottom. That's over a quarter of the budget. Now, Mariah Parker has put forward the 50-10 plan for the Athens-Clarke County. And this plan called for a 50% reduction in the Athens-Clarke County Police Department budget over 10 years, hence 50-10. And it called for a lot of that funding to be reallocated towards mental health services and public defenders. And of course, we're going to talk a lot more about that during our town hall. My understanding is that component mentioned did not pass, but a lot of that additional funding towards mental health services and public defenders did get enacted, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Okay. But yeah, that's just as some background of Mariah Parker's background and some of the work she's been working towards. But to not waste any more time, we can start going into the actual interview. So I think we're going to open this up for any questions from the audience. So feel free to, if you're currently an attendee, just feel free to put in the chat or the Q&A box. The Q&A would be easiest since I think we all get notifications for that immediately, but it's up to you.
So I'll be reading out the questions. I'm Lucy, she, her. Mariah, if there's anything you wanted to add to that presentation, feel free.
I think y'all did a bang up job of kind of contextualizing how we got here, and my attempts as not only a socialist but also an abolitionist to introduce local policy that addresses the issue of austerity in our communities and how that's linked to police violence. And so thanks for that great introduction. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Cool. All right, we have some pre-prepared questions, and then as audience questions roll in, we'll start shifting over to those. Our first question was, why do you think that we should defund the police?
Sure. So I think it all goes back to understanding how we got here in like a broader historical sense. So in reaction to the abolition of slavery after 1865, we saw a drastic inflation in both criminalization of Blackness through the Black codes, prohibiting anything from intermarriage to whether or not Black people could play baseball in certain spaces, vagrancy laws, and things like that. The use of like sharecropping to put people in debt. If they couldn't pay their debts, they would then go to jail. And with that, a skyrocketing of the Black population that was incarcerated. So pre-slavery abolition, the majority of people incarcerated in the South, the vast majority were white. That trend completely reversed in like the 20 years that followed the abolition of slavery. So it kind of shows us the way that our carceral system, and particularly police forces as well down here in the South, where they were used oftentimes and predominantly formed as a formalized institution to catch runaway slaves. In fact, in like a newspaper from Athens, Clarke County, around the time of Reconstruction, there was an op-ed in the newspaper calling for the formation of a police department to specifically catch runaway, vagrant freedmen and abolitionists and insurrectionists. So particularly people like rising up against the state, people that believed in Black people's freedom, and then Black people themselves. Like that's who we need to police, and so that's why we need a police department. Like that logic was used here in Athens, Clarke County, and in municipalities across the South. And so there's like this inherent link between this desire for social control over Black populations, and the way we see that historically in the way that when we exited the era of chattel slavery, we entered a new era of slavery with the hyper incarceration of people of color and the hyper policing of people of color as well. And so I think defunding the police gets at the root of a lot of our social problems by, as Nikhil kind of referenced in the introduction, abandoning austerity politics, really investing in our communities in ways that are actually affirming for Black life, affirming for all life, and diverting those funds away from an institution that is used for that social control as was desired in the many decades and centuries since slavery was abolished. And so as it stands, there's this public desire to discipline, to punish, to socially isolate, to put people away rather than having to deal with them. But if we take those funds and actually invest in a lot of the social services that are needed for folks to live affirming lives, to be food secure, housing secure, to have gainful employment, to have access to educational opportunities, and also to have democratic control over their communities, we eliminate the sources of a lot of the crime that we experience. And so both from a historical perspective and then as like an overarching framework today for the relationship between austerity politics and social control, I feel like defunding the police is largely like a huge solution to a lot of the problems that we have as communities. Gotcha,
great answer. Then from there, we wanted to go in a little bit more specifically on the 50-10 plan. So what exactly does it involve, and why do you support it?
Sure. So the 50-10 plan, I want to take a step back and say that I do identify as an abolitionist, having studied the works of people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore and other revolutionaries, many of whom are also, have been parts of socialist and communist movements over the last 40 years. And so I as someone that recognizes that one day we can create a world where the police and prisons are no longer necessary, I want to own up to the fact that the 50-10 plan is woefully inadequate. But also what I hope to do with it is speak to the current political context and the current political will within the body that I sit on. So recognizing that I, at the time, was perhaps the only abolitionist elected office in the entire state of Georgia, okay, how do we use this overarching framework of, investing in our communities, divesting from social control, but have something that's like palatable for like a current moment. And so while I think the work of abolitionist organizing and policy does require us to divest from policing in order to divest directly in community, and things like community gardens and youth development programs and paying people, $20 an hour for their labor, et cetera. A lot of my colleagues think of crime as like this impermeable, this thing that's never going to go away, that we can't deal with. And so trying to frame the first step towards abolition as diversifying the types of crisis response we have in our communities, because we have seen that the police are not equipped to handle the variety of crises that arise in our neighborhoods. And so implementing a more diverse and specialized forms of crisis response that are not linked to punishment, are not linked to carcerality, or instead linked to getting people access to the sorts of services they need to avoid recidivism, to avoid taking part in a crime eventually, and becomes stable in the way they need to have their behavioral needs met, and then therefore keeping the social fabric of our communities strong by not ripping them away from us and putting them in jail somewhere. So having studied models like the Cahoots program, piloted in the 1980s by the Whitebird Clinic in Eugene, Oregon, where instead of sending cops to a mental health episode or something to do with homelessness or public intoxication or a loitering issue or trespassing or a lot of these low-level crimes, they'd send an EMT and a social worker. And they would find that someone acting erratically in public, if you check their blood sugar, they might have diabetes and they're acting weird because they just need orange juice, something as simple as that, to have a kind of response that's more attuned to people's not only behavioral health, but broader physical health as well. And then connecting those people to services they need to become stable. So somebody trespassing because they need a voucher to get into some housing themselves. Are they out threatening people in front of the 7-Eleven because they're hungry and they haven't eaten in days and they're just trying to get $20 to buy some Slim Jims or whatever. Okay, we need to connect them with some food pantries where they can get some food that they need, etc. And so looking at different programs around the country that, rather than reinvent the wheel, the things that have actually been working really effectively in other municipalities, the Whitebird Clinic, for example, saves the county there millions of dollars a year in both emergency room expenses, people that would show up there, they're having a psychotic episode, and then they end up in some sort of institution, and if they're uninsured, they can't pay. Instead, having someone meet that person with a more compassionate response where they are, diverting funds from that as well as police response itself. And so just taking time-tested models from around the country and compiling that as a way for us to more flexibly respond to different kinds of situations that crop up. So instead of asking the police to be, to show up at a house party and tell the teenagers to turn the music down and talk a man off a train bridge who's about to jump in and end his life, and take a little kid home that wandered out of his house and is lost in his neighborhood, and respond to a broken taillight if somebody is about to turn onto their street, all these different things that they're asked to do. Instead, having a kind of response for each of those situations that helps us avoid criminalizing folks for just basic everyday things that happen. And so what my plan asked for at the time was to fund an implementation plan to study both the types of crises we're having in our community and their volume, and then scale different kinds of responses attuned to the needs demonstrated in our community, and then over a 10-year period, phase those kinds of services in and phase out our reliance upon the police department for dealing with all these different types of things. And so it wasn't even committing us to necessarily doing this all in a year or 10 years, but really laying out a roadmap for how we could get there, and then recommendations for year by year as we revisit the budget with each recurring budget cycle. All right, well, at this stage, given the way that crime has fallen over the last year following the 50-10 plan, let's add this many new mental health co-responders to our independent agency that responds to mental health calls, et cetera. And so that was in essence what I proposed to do. That there's still so much, again, I'd like to say, like, it was not addressed by it. For example, just investing in some of the investing in community needs that the things I like to call the upstream, things that lie upstream of crises in the first place. So addressing, hunger, homelessness, education, all these different kinds of things that that if well funded, can prevent people from getting into a crisis situation in the first place, which I think is a very important component of the work of abolitionist organizing and policy, and a lot of what people mean when they say they defund the police. And move in, sub movements and movement ecologies across the country. But this is what it looked like for us in Athens at the time. And I still feel very optimistic that it can be done, despite the fact that HB 286 did pass the Georgia House and Senate last week. God, I don't know, time's flying. Because ultimately, what the plan could potentially specify that we need to increase our public safety spending in certain ways. And it does not prohibit us from restructuring our public safety department. We currently have a police department, but there's nothing in it to my knowledge, that would prevent us from creating and, in essence, abolishing our police department and establishing a Department of Public Safety that houses the police, as well as our Office of Social Work and our Office of Homeless Outreach and other sorts of public safety activities that are not necessarily carceral or punitive. And so I still feel optimistic that elements of this plan could be enacted on a year-by-year basis. I do think at the time, the broad commitment to this long overarching goal was still beyond the scope of where we were at as a community in terms of just the political will, discourse, and understanding of what abolition means. And so this year we're looking to fund a form of non-police crisis response as an independent agency outside the police department to start taking care of some of those low-level calls that currently, cause a high amount of our homeless population end up in jail when they're just hanging on the corner, they're sleeping in an abandoned house. What's the big deal? Things like that. And so very optimistic about that. And so there's elements of this plan that I still think have merit, not only for their political feasibility in our current climate, but also in terms of the way pushing for, in my role as an elected official, I feel like a lot of what I do as someone that is pretty far to the left of most of my colleagues is pushing the discourse in a new direction and doing a lot of political education around the possibilities for local government. And so while the plan didn't pass, thousands of people wrote us emails in support of it. Hundreds of people came out to City Hall to support it. And it just helped people understand what does defund the police mean? What potential does it hold for a neighborhood? And in a sense, planted seeds that we are now seeing grow here. We're now seeing grow in other places. And so despite the fact that, yes, it did not pass. Elements of it did pass. We did get an increase in funding for the public defender's office so that anyone that's charged with a, crime gets fair, thorough legal representation, as well as a new social worker in the public defender's office so that we can connect people to the resources they need so they avoid recidivism or, faithfully enact their legal plan and maybe avoid getting as much jail time as they might otherwise. And so there's parts that did pass, but even the parts that didn't, I think laid the groundwork for some work we're doing now and for some just broad-based political education that I think was really valuable for Athens as a whole. So I just talked a whole bunch, so my bad.
Just a quick question, just to provide some additional context for people. What exactly was HB 286?
Sure, yeah. So HB 286 was a bill actually sponsored by the two of the three Athens State House representatives, Houston Gaines and Marcus Wiedauer, that bans municipalities from reducing their police department budgets by more than 5% in a single year, with some, different exceptions for like if your revenues as a city fall, et cetera. And in their argument for it, they directly cited the 50-10 plan and the radicals in Athens, Clarke County, Georgia, that must be stopped. But if they had, I've told many people this, I feel like if they had a better understanding of what we were trying to do, they would have done a better job of trying to stop us for the reasons just stated of how we can still continue this work, those barriers notwithstanding. So yeah.
Technically, if I'm doing my math right, 50% reduction over 10 years, that can still fit within the 5%.
That's exactly. So.
Yeah, so you went into this a good bit already, but why, like, specifically did you choose 50-10 over like 75-5 or, like 105? Like, was it just like that you didn't think that something like that would even have a shot, or?
It was honestly like trying to balance the concerns of like abolitionists that I organized with, who were like looking at what at the time was happening in Minneapolis, where the Minneapolis City Council had signed on a resolution vowing to abolish the police department, and they were like, why don't we abolish the police department this year? And then like knowing where my colleagues were at of like, let's give the police more funding. So like, where do we meet in the middle? Like 50% seems like right in the middle of what I'm hearing from either side of the situation. And then there's no real reason why 10 years stuck, other than it doesn't seem as scary as like doing it all right now. It seems like very piecemeal, and like a lot of the folks centrists on my who I govern with, the idea they might buy into that because it is more incremental. So yeah,
they're also good round numbers, I guess.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience. How did you approach discussing the 50-10 plan with the general public, and how receptive have your constituents been with the idea?
Well, a lot of times I would, this was before we even started organizing around a specific piece of policy, like I would feel calls from people constantly about they're scared their kids are going to get involved in gangs because there's not enough after school programs for them to be in, or they've been picked up by the police already because they were loitering in a group of like 5 young Black men, and that was seen as, oh, this must be some sort of criminal activity going on, let me go stop them at like 15 and 16 years old. I lived until very recently around the corner from a homeless shelter, and had relationships with a lot of folks that frequented there, come to my door often asking for, money for this or that, to, or shoes or pants or just basic needs, and thinking about the fact that these same people are getting harassed by the cops for like pitching at tents on the sidewalk or for drinking in the park, and things like that. So often when I talk to people about how the Black community particularly has been underinvested in Athens, they're just crying out for just an equitable investment, like after decades and decades of austerity. But no one had ever been bold enough to just like say where we could get the money from. And so when I kind of came back to a lot of conversations I'd already had with constituents about their young men getting picked up by the police, or not having, youth development programs, or not being able to get jobs because they're competing with the university population. The fact that we don't have enough affordable housing, I would say, hey, remember last week when we talked about this? What if we took the money from the police department? And then like through more robust and thorough conversation, elaborating what that linkage is. Like, well, if everyone has a house, we don't have to send the cops to like round people up in the park. And that makes your neighborhood safer because you don't have, homeless people out drinking 40s on your corner, because those people live somewhere now and they're like having a party at their house like a normal person or whatever. Like, so creating those linkages between how housing is public safety, how healthcare is public safety, how food security is public safety, how education is public safety. And so a lot of times people were like, okay, yeah, that sounds cool. Sometimes people were a little hesitant. And that's where just generally in our organizing as like leftists, I think it's really important, like the multiple touch model of just like connecting with people. They might not be down for, collectivization of the means of production, like the first time we talked to them. But if you keep coming back, and I'd be like, oh, okay, that sounds all right. And so, through multiple touches and through connecting, like the question of where do we get the money from for all the things that people call me about all the time that we need, to the issue of the fact that 40% of our city budget goes to public safety right now.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's do one question that's a little bit less focused on like specific policies and
Sure.
take it more to the ideal. So like, let's say that it's like maybe 100 or 200 years down the line, we've done the revolution. You know, we can create the society that we want to create. What does the role of police and also prisons look like in that society for you?
Yeah. And so I struggle with this question a lot because someone that does openly identify as an abolitionist and like, you know, has done a lot of studying, a lot of organizing the folks in that community, we're expected to have all the answers. So like, oh, what do we do with like sexual abusers or like pedophiles and like all these like really like the scary kinds of crime? And so my answer I feel like is a bit of a cop out, but like I think in our work, like it's really important to understand like to appropriately like scope like what our goals are in order to not burn out or feel like, oh, it's not possible, I'll give up on the revolution, I'm going to watch Netflix. And so yes, I'm really glad that in your question the framing is like 100 or 200 years from now, what does that look like? Because for me, I'm not going to be here and most of us aren't going to be here. And so I think our role then is setting up the world, creating the conditions for our children, their children, to carry the baton forward and figure out what the final, you know, what crossing the finish line looks like in that regard. So, you know, what does like the world without prisons entirely look like? What does a world without, you know, police entirely look like? Which like some would say that it's a world without a state. And so there's a whole lot of other stuff that goes into that as well. And so I asked myself, like, I might not have those answers, but like, what can I do in the meantime to set up the world where someone else can figure it out? And so thinking about how we, you know, like recognizing that I'm probably not going to abolish the Athens Clarke County Police Department in my lifetime. Like, how do we decrease our reliance on police, both through policy action and through community organizing with regards to the ways we can keep each other safe as neighbors? Because a lot of it actually doesn't have to do with like state solutions, because the state is the problem with a lot of the time with so many different policy things. And so thinking about like, you know, teaching one another de-escalation tactics, knowing our neighbors such that like, oh, I know my neighbor has like XYZ issue, and so like I'm gonna show up and be there for them in this way, knowing that when I have XYZ issue on my end that I have, they'll show up for me in these ways, and that way we take care of each other and never escalates to the point where, well, my neighbor's walking down naked, knocking down the street naked, I guess I'm gonna call the police. Right? Or like, oh, I see their kid wandering around at night, like I'm gonna call the police. Instead, we know each other, we have these relationships, we look out for each other. A lot of that work. And so I do think that just like by investing in community, by like making sure people's basic needs are met, pretty much making sure, I mean, you know, as socialists as well, making sure like the fruits of our labor actually return to the folks that create that value. Largely, like we can reduce a lot of crime, if not all of it. The question is, can we reduce all of it, is one that I can't answer. I don't know if that will deal with all of it. Maybe there, you know, will still be murder or whatever kind of heinous acts in a world where we have defunded the police to the point where people have their needs met. And our communities are strong enough that we have systems of accountability in place where we can deal with harm amongst neighbors without the state, just like as neighbors, as friends, as family members. And so there are questions that I can't answer, but I feel like my job is to get us to the point where we've set up the next generation well to address those lingering questions about a world without police and prisons.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you just want to set up, you know, a framework so people in the future can decide what community safety looks like to them.
Exactly. And that's ultimately what, you know, like what justice will look like to me is very different than what justice will look like for a different person. And so those answers will actually probably be determined by communities. You know, rather than the state saying one size fits all approach to what accountability looks like, it's probably on a neighborhood basis. Like, this is how we do things around here. Yes, I have a story that goes along with that, but I can save it if we have other questions.
Let's see how we're doing on time. Yeah, if you wanna tell the story.
Sure. So yeah. So So shortly before I was elected, I ran for office for my first time in 2018. About 3 weeks before the election, my aunt was murdered by my cousin, who had run away from the military and been trained in weaponry while there, but because of his own mental illness, like couldn't take it and escaped and was being what's the word? Like he was a fugitive and like being hidden at my family's house. And so he snapped and he, kidnapped my aunt and killed her. And so he was 19 years old at the time. And the state sought the death penalty for him. And through that process of like watching my family grieve and missing my aunt dearly and grieving as well, I thought a lot about how we got there in the first place. So this was a young kid who grew up in rural North Carolina, who we knew he had mental health issues his entire life, but he never got treatment because the nearest doctor lived an hour away. There weren't any jobs where he lived, and so the only choice he had was to go into the military, where he learned how to use weapons. And they give the promise of we will pay for your college, etc. He couldn't have gone to college any other way. And so, his mother, undiagnosed bipolar disorder, which led to drug abuse in her history. Also driven by, lack of economic opportunity, lack of educational opportunity, social isolation, all of these problems that if we had society had fixed, my aunt would still be alive. And I just fixated on that so much because the solution that the state imposed upon our family, like we didn't want the death penalty for my cousin. They were like, we were going to sentence this 19-year-old kid to die. In the best case scenario, he spends the rest of his life in prison where, much like the military, he will probably only become more violent. And so I bring up that story because justice looked very different for my family than what was imposed upon us by the state, by like the people who were coming to like bring us justice. And so I'm just very sensitive to that like we live in a world still where like victims of police violence often want to jail the cops, and like how do we honor that, as well as folks who recognize that the system will never bring us justice, and how do we honor that? And so and the importance of within abolition, I think the community determination of what accountability looks like, because what prisons do is they rip apart the social fabric of your neighborhood. They take your mom, they take your dad, they take your cousin, they take your best friend. And without those supports, they're just thrown into an environment where all they know is people who sell drugs and have killed people and et cetera. And they don't have the supports they need to both feel like valued members of society, that like it's worth it to, be in community with others. And there's no sense of like, I care about these people care about me and I care about them and I want to do better through, a process of accountability. That's just like, well, I was held accountable by going to jail, so I guess I'm going to go out and just do the same old thing because I've been there's a whole me-shaped hole in like the tapestry of my neighborhood now, and like I don't have a connection to why it's important not to hurt other people, etc. And so community is everything. Abolition has very much to do with like the building strong communities, not just in a sense of resourcing them, but like, do you know your neighbors? Do you know like what they go through, what they need? Do they know what your needs are? So can they look out for you? What does it look like when one of us hurts the other? Like, how can we chart a path towards healing and, stitching back together that fabric together? So there is no, so I guess I bring up that story because like there is no one size fits all approach to what justice looks like. And I think the road towards like full abolition figures out like both how do we educate people around the ways other forms of accountability are better, but also honoring like different people are going to want different things rather than having this one size fits all approach.
It's a really powerful story. I totally agree. Community is everything.
Yeah.
So we have an audience question. How can we get people on board who agree the police should be demilitarized and reformed, but don't agree with a more fundamental defunding or abolition?
Well, the pivot that I've taken recently is like proving it to them. It's like if they can't on a logical basis like grasp the idea, show them how it works. So with regards to Athens Clarke County, we might not be able to like take money away from the police department this year, but what if we just 1 year just jacked up our investment in like community gardens and youth education programs and job skills training programs, and start paying our employees more so that no one who works for the government lives in poverty and all these things, and see what that does to the crime rate. And when it's like, look, y'all, we invested in the community and the crime went down. Like, if you have that like evidence to show people, I think it's then a lot easier to just be like, okay, now we're gonna take cops money, because what do we need them for? We lowered crime by making sure everyone eats and has a house of it and a roof over their head. Why do we even need them that much? And so that's one approach, from like a tactical perspective as well in terms of like policy work. But yeah, it's tricky because some people just don't want to go there, despite all of the decades of evidence that reforms haven't worked. But if they see it before their own eyes, like in their own neighborhood, like, oh wow, like, my house is getting broken into because like there's not homelessness here anymore. Maybe we can convince people that way. That's what I'm trying to do.
Cool. Another audience question. Have you seen components of transformative justice that are popular with constituents / could be feasibly passed in the near future?
That is a really interesting like avenue within abolitionist organizing, like thinking about transformative justice within like state sanctioned accountability processes. It's not something that I've actively like been working on, because I feel like a lot of that does fall on like our district attorney's office, our solicitor's office, etc. And not necessarily, I mean, they might get the funding from us, but it's not necessarily something that we as a commission would like legislate into being. It's more like a policy choice of those other offices, other elected offices. But I do think there's a lot of ways that like transformative justice in a certain sense already exists in our neighborhoods, but isn't because it's not institutional. Like, people don't recognize how powerful it is. Like when you get in a fight with your cousin, like, oh, you're real mad he didn't show up to your birthday party, and y'all deal with it, y'all talk it out and like figure out how. And yes, it's not like a crime, but then again, the crime is a social construct. Like white collar crime, you don't see them getting maced and like beaten with batons and thrown in the paddy wagon. So like thinking about what if we applied these same principles we use every day with people in our lives to kinds of harm that the state deems worthy to take you to jail for. And so I juggle a lot, and this is worth a whole other conversation if y'all want to have me back sometime, because like being like an organizer but also being like an elected official, it's like, what is my job here? Like there's like the stuff the state does, but organizing is not limited to just like pushing for policy. There's so much power to be built in our communities. And so I think if I like put on my organizer hat and spend a little more time in these streets and less time in City Hall, something I would like to push for is just like community education around like transformative justice as it already exists as a practice and its potential applications with a wider variety of circumstance to shrink our reliance upon like carceral solutions. But I'd be all up in the policy making all the time, so it's not something I've worked on enough. But that's why I appreciate the work of the folks that don't give a fuck about electoralism, etc. It's like, yeah, you go out there and you teach the neighborhood how to like how to do transformative justice, boo-boo. So that's one, because the state, there's so many problems with just the government existing. But anyway, so yeah, thank you for that question. I didn't answer it at all. I totally just like weave my way around it. But there's only so much we can do. I recognize my role. I'm an elected official. I gotta like stay in my lane with policy and give props and shout outs to the people doing the work in the streets in other ways, because like we need both. So.
Gotcha. All right. Another audience question. what was it like interviewing Immortal Technique for your podcast? What was he like to talk to, and what was he like in person?
Yeah, he is wild. He's prolific talker, loves to talk, which for a podcast is like exactly what you want. It was really dope. Like every time you ask him something very specific about him, he brings it back to the context in which it happened and like systems. So for example, we asked him a question about like, apparently in like 1999, he like built an orphanage in Afghanistan or something, or like 2009 maybe. And so my co-host was like, what was that like? And then instead of at all talking about his experience of opening an orphanage in Afghanistan, he just talked about imperialism and like the military industrial complex and why it necessitated him doing that. And so like he always brings it back to like community, always brings it back to like the broader historical and like socio-political context in which things are happening. Always brings it back to just like studying history, understanding of just like movement work that has gone before us and how it informs like what he does, which was really cool. Because like as a rapper, like rappers got a lot of ego, right? So you expect to be like, yeah, that's right, I built an orphanage, but it all every single time brought it back to just like the broader like the systemic level, which is really impressive. So yeah, he was a cool dude and very chill dude. Yeah, very, very chill dude. So that episode of the show, my podcast is called Waiting on Reparations, and that episode is coming out in I think 2 weeks. So check for that wherever you get your podcasts.
Cool. Yeah, I'm jealous. That sounds awesome.
It was real dope. Yeah, it was real cool.
So I want to ask a question about music. Music is, like helped me a lot, like through my journey to the left, and my politics affect my music as well. How have your political beliefs influenced your music, and vice versa?
Well, before, like, I had a more like studied, shall I say, like political framework for like how I move in the world. Like I did get a sense of like the personal being political, that like anything rappers talk about in their songs is like shaped by public policy in some way. It's all that's why they call it like the CNN of the hood, because it's like we are the journalists of like the way the public policy has failed us. So even in my early music, some of what y'all were playing earlier, like it may not be explicitly political, like get out and vote, get out in the streets, da 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 da. But it's like speaking to the failures of public policy, like my mental health struggles because of how difficult it's been to access mental health care, reproductive health care as well on that front. The white supremacy and how that it's impacted my sense of identity and the way I've moved in the world, all these kinds of things. And so I think that politics like have pushed me to I guess like tell stories that I think people need to hear in order for us to like uncover new truths about the way government has been failing us previously. But these days, I have seen how, and particularly through a lot of my favorite rappers, who like just be rapping like crazy nonsense, but like it's really catchy, And I'm like, man, what if I could make a song that was like really catchy and like it was not till the fifth time you listen to it that you realize I'm talking about labor organizing, and you're like, oh snap, like this is a union where I work, and then like you go join a union or something. And so like thinking about the ways that hip hop as just like aesthetic, like from a pure aesthetic point of view, can be used to like subliminally like politically educate, I guess has been increasingly on my mind, especially during the pandemic. Now that I'm not touring anymore, I've had a lot of time to write, and I've been very mad about a lot of things. And so so policy demands as well as like organizing tactics have made their way into like my lyrics a lot more, for sure.
Another question about music. Who would you say your biggest influences were?
The biggest influences. My favorite rapper is A$AP Rock, because I grew up listening to hip hop, but like never really identified with it because like I was a nerd and like shy, and I was a girl and queer and like all these things, da 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 da. But then like I listened to his music and realized you can rap about anything you want at all. I was like, you can rap about like riding around dirt bikes when you're 7 years old and you're like suburban neighborhood. You can write about getting like doing haircuts in your backyard for $2 because you can't pay rent. Like just you can write about anything. You fantastical stuff, mundane stuff. You can create all these worlds in your music and discover that through his music. And that's what inspired me to start writing my own music. But very inspired by, the standards, J. Cole, Kendrick, No Name, MF Doom, people like that. But partially because either they like, I think, provide that journalism, that journalistic aspect of hip hop that like I think is like really raw and like important to like to plug into, or they further exemplify like, oh, you can make hip hop out whatever, like to unchain what it means to be a hip hopper, and the work of like MF Doom being very like goofy and stuff like that. So and as all y'all know, probably like No Name is just flames. She's so great. She's like so dope. So yeah, she's just real good. But anyway.
Cool. Yeah, I love No Name. And R.I.P. MF Doom, the GOAT.
R.I.P. the homie.
So we've got another audience question. What was your experience running for office as an explicit socialist, and what components of your campaign do you see as the most helpful?
Cool. So I guess I have to say I came into my socialism, shall I say, post 2018. So a lot of, and to this day, I'll tell people I'm like a member of DSA, but when I claim socialism, people then expect me to be an expert on it. And I argue, and I'm really not, like, other than like valuing the democratization of like the way like resources are distributed, the way we participate in politics, and the ownership of the means of production. Like, I haven't read a ton of theory. I'm going to be super honest with you. Not in the way that I have read a ton of like abolitionist theory. And so like early on in my run for office, like abolition very much more like shaped my like platform, my political framework, my just understanding of like what to do within politics. And so yeah, becoming a socialist, I guess, has happened really like in the last like year and a half or so, of just understanding that beyond trying to beat white supremacy, beat homophobia, beat all these things, like if we come together like across our like identity differences on the grounds of class, like imagining what we can done, like mwah. And I'm also very eager to learn a lot more about like what socialist municipal policy looks like. I do have ideas around using our economic development department to encourage the creation of worker cooperatives, and things like that, as well as how we can use our housing and community development department to create tenant-owned housing cooperatives as well. So like the cooperativization, I guess you could say, of various aspects of our economy, as well as our like neighborhoods. And so beyond that, I'm still learning a lot about like, all right, like, what does it mean to be a socialist city council person, given all the strictures that we operate under from the state legislature and the federal government. And so it's like still a journey for me, but like we're being, part of DSA and like working with people like, PSL as well, and trying to learn the best I can from people who have worked in local government before me. There's a whole, sewer socialism, like going way back, that there are lessons in, and, the way that people like, Bernie Sanders governed as mayor of Burlington, etc., that I can like bring into the way that I govern. But yeah, that's still like, seeping its way into my governance, though my politics more broadly, in terms of like what the federal government should be up to, what the state government should be up to, are not as confined, because they have a lot more resources at their disposal, a lot more power at their disposal to make the changes I think we need to achieve socialism.
Cool. So we have 5 more minutes. If people want to post any final questions, we may have time for one more. But in the meantime, I wanted to ask our final prepared question.
Cool. And then I have a rap about DSA, so I gotta hit y'all with that before I dip, obviously.
Hell yeah. So what's your advice for people who might be interested in getting involved in local politics?
My advice is local politics is a swimming pool. Like, don't you dip your toes in and it hurts, and you dip your ankles in and it hurts. But if you just dive in, like, you're in it and it doesn't hurt. And so, like, when I ran for office, like, I had very little policy experience, not really a whole strong coalition behind me, but I was like, you know what? Ain't nobody else gonna like do this. This man is about to run unopposed. His predecessor ran unopposed for 25 years. Fuck that. And just like dove headfirst into it. And I think there's so much value in that. I think there's so much value in especially like running for office as like inexperienced people with good hearts and willingness to work hard and learn a lot. Because through conversations, through campaigning, we have the power to transform people's expectation of their local government, and what is possible through local government. And I think that's more powerful than like winning or losing. Like if people suddenly expect more, demand more, understand how the government works more. And so I invite all of you to run for something: school board, dog catcher, city council. Just get out there and just dive in. Yeah, none of this like put your pinky toe in like, oh, why is it cold? Like, no, that's not it. And so yes, jump in, cannonball, gotta do it.
Awesome. Well, we don't have any more audience questions, so I'll go ahead and hand the floor over to you for
all right, we'll close out. All right, so imagine a minute. Millions of average women and men in the tragic position of trading in passion for wages and cash because they shackled by capitalism. Imagine a minute. Millions of average citizens planting the spinach and waxing the kitchens and stacking the linens, contractors and renters and tenants that labor extracted for pennies. What if they coordinated to address the sordid state of it in an organization? Guess fucking what? That's sort of what DSA does. And not even sort of, it's more of the crux. Taking the power from hoarders of bucks, big bankers offshoring their cuts, returning the power of labor to those who created the billionaires owe it to us. So if you're jaded and surly about waking up early to earn a bag, if you're sad about burning, if you got a curious journey and had it with passively lurking, we got your back and we happy to have you. We are the DSA actively working.
Hell yeah, mic drop. Well, thank you so much for coming and taking the time. Yeah, if you have anything else to add, feel free. But if you want to shout anything out.
I'm on Twitter break, sort of. So, but you can follow. Ada's laughing because they probably know that I've been like cheating on my Twitter break. But I'm mostly off Twitter right now. But you can follow me on Twitter when I come back at let me put it. What's it? Here's the chat. Great. At Mariah for Athens, also Mariah for Athens on Instagram. And just hit me up about just like policy ideas. I love working, like I like being responsive to like social movements is like various like critical to my governance style, like working with just movement workers on what policy should look like. So if y'all like got a cool idea for something we should do, just hit me up. I'll think about it. I'll see what I can do. So yeah. And then especially if you're gonna run for office, hit me up as well. Because I did it one time and pretty much, I did okay at it apparently. So yeah, that's it. I appreciate y'all having me.